Malcolm in the Middle is possibly the best TV show of all time, especially if we're considering longevity. There are some great British TV shows like Father Ted, The IT Crowd, The Office, and Blackadder, but take every episode from all those shows combined, and that's still not even half as long as Malcolm in the Middle. So if you want a show that was consistently great for over 100 episodes and has basically no bad ones, except the clip shows, Malcolm in the Middle stands alone. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia maybe if you prefer more absurdist humour. The true Brexit geezer in me is inclined to point out that despite me admitting the best TV shows of all time might well be American comedies, they are American comedies that feel very British. The standard criticism of American comedies is that they excise a lot of the grit and cynicism from real life, engendering an overall blander product. I mean, just look at the difference between the British and American Office exemplified by Jim and Tim, or Michael Scott and David Brent.
Don't make me redundant. Please.
Look, David.
I've changed my mind. I don't want redundancy. I don't want that. I haven't signed anything, so...
Well, David, unfortunately it's not really up to you.
No, okay then.
Sorry.
All right then. Well, I'm asking. Okay? Please don't make me redundant.
So the appeal of shows like Malcolm in the Middle to me is that they are a bit more cynical. It's about characters dealing with very real problems and facing genuine hardships. It's also just really funny. For me, it probably is the best comedy series ever. So if I critique the final episode, I'm doing it begrudgingly, and with the caveat that I tend to be critical of finales. It's really difficult to pull off a perfect ending to any series, because how do you wrap everything up in a satisfying way? This isn't me saying, oh, look at how badly they screwed up the ending. It's completely terrible. But there are some aspects of it that left me feeling disappointed. Obviously, the show is mostly about the titular character, and his conclusion gets the most attention. The big conclusion for Jamie and Dewey is just that they're left in the house as the final two brothers. It is nice to get the sense parts of the story will continue after the show has ended. Hal and Lois also maintain that sense of continuity with the frankly horrifying ending that they're having another kid. As a closing joke, it's brilliant. The more substantial endings are for the three eldest brothers, starting with the oldest. Francis's ending is pretty interesting. I never liked the way he loses his job at the ranch, since that seemed like a really great job for him to have. Most of his final appearances are depressing, but he sort of clutches victory from the jaws of defeat, as here he has a job. The twist is that this job is a boring, steady corporate job, which runs completely contrary to his erstwhile rebellious nature. The positive spin on this is that it shows development in a wants versus needs way. Francis wanted to live a pretty easygoing life with no commitments, but instead he ends up living a life completely contrary to that. However, I have two issues. I don't think it's necessary to take away so much of Francis's character, nor does it make much sense that he changes so dramatically. The great thing about the ranch is that there's a connection between Francis's rebellious spirit and the idealized, rugged individualism of the American West. It's actually a perfect place for Francis to make the most of who he is. I mean, his time at military school gave him discipline, while his time in Alaska allowed him to weather rough conditions. I'm sure there's a more satisfying direction they could have gone with him staying at the grotto. If they absolutely had to have him settle down to a more corporate neutered job, then the obvious way to do that would be for him to have kids. At least then there's a trade-off. He sacrifices some of his free-spirited energy for the sake of his family. Although honestly, there's no real reason why he'd need to leave the grotto to take care of his kids. That seems like a great place to raise kids, and that sentiment could perhaps see Francis become a bit more old-fashioned in his mindset as a family man. That would be a character progression that makes sense. And as such, his parents could see that he's matured, rather than the closing joke being that he's still gaslighting his mum into thinking that he's a complete failure. Speaking of failure, Reese's conclusion also isn't great. In some sense though, it is my favourite of the three. Reese was never academic, so it's nice to see him find enjoyment from doing decent, honest manual labour. The only issue I have is that Reese was established as being a great chef, so I don't know quite why they fully abandoned that aspect of his character. You'd think they could achieve the same thing by having him working a similarly low-level job, but at a restaurant, where his aspiration is eventually to work his way up and become a successful chef. Still, I don't have too many issues with Reese because I like the message that doing any honest job can be fulfilling for someone, and there's nothing wrong with that. Especially since there's nothing really about Reese to indicate he wouldn't like this job. So this leaves the big one. What about Malcolm's future? We don't really see it, but it's implied he will become president of the United States. In a speech that I think we're supposed to take as canonically authoritative, Lois explains how Malcolm will go to university despite being unable to afford it, and he will work multiple jobs just to scrape by, while still working on his studies, and through sheer force of will, he'll eventually work his way into politics and eventually become president of the United States. The issue is, I don't buy it. Firstly, I don't buy that Malcolm actually would succeed in spite of all this adversity. Sure, he's naturally smart, but he's not especially hardworking, certainly not as hardworking as you'd need to be to pay for your college education while still getting good grades. We've seen Malcolm be willing to sacrifice his education for girls before, so are we really going to pretend that won't happen when he's at university? Honestly, if I had to predict how this would play out, I expect he'd slack off on his studying, make some enemies of powerful people at the university, and end up getting expelled or flunking out. But let's suppose that he does buckle down and actually get good grades and pay his way through university. Frankly, I don't think the Malcolm we see in this show would even want to be president. He generally doesn't like calling attention to himself or taking on loads of responsibility. In this very episode, we see that he'd rather take on a six-figure salary to work for a company instead of pursuing his education. Is there any reason at all to think that would change while he's at university? Still, even if he does have the motivation to try to become president, I don't think there's a viable path for him to do that based on getting good grades. This series came out during the Bush presidency, so they had no excuse for believing being smart is useful for becoming president. That's the biggest issue with this ending. It's abandoning the cynicism that the show had previously so successfully translated into top-tier comedy. It constantly made fun of how fundamentally corrupt and broken the American system is.
They're gonna pay you what all jobs pay. Less than you're worth and just enough to keep you crawling back for more.
But suddenly, at the last minute, we're supposed to buy a conclusion that relies on America having a wonderful system where a really smart guy can become president based on how hard he works. And of course, we're also supposed to believe that if Malcolm became president, he would dramatically improve things for working people. I don't see why Malcolm in particular wouldn't be corrupted by somewhere like Washington. Indeed, the show libs out so much they genuinely go down the route of saying, policy doesn't matter as long as you have good intentions and a good character, everything will be fine. Well, no. Recent events suggest lacking clear policy objectives and just running on abstract virtues is not an election-winning strategy, and even if it was, I don't think the resulting government would actually solve any real problems.
What are my foreign policy objectives?
That doesn't matter.
The lack of any clear policies is why this feels like a massive departure from Malcolm's character. He doesn't seem to have any big ideas about how he thinks the world should be. He hasn't expressed any political sentiments at all. And if we do accept that his presidency would just be about personality and values, that doesn't work either. Malcolm isn't charismatic, the last speech he does isn't exactly inspiring, also, he's kind of a jerk. Whether Malcolm cares about working people is neither here nor there. He's a smug genius who clearly thinks he's better than everyone around him. The fact is, the average working person wouldn't vote for him and he'd lose in a landslide. Now obviously they do present this trajectory for Malcolm's life as supposedly fixing his big character flaw. If Malcolm has a singular flaw, it's that he thinks he's better than everyone else. He's arrogant. But I just think this is complete nonsense.
Finally, you will realize that there's more to life than proving you're the smartest person in the world.
Everything we see about Malcolm suggests that being in a situation where he's constantly looked down on by people who are much less intelligent than him just because they're from wealthier backgrounds would only ever increase his resentment. We already have a character like this in a classic sitcom. His name was Frank Grimes, and his resentment at having to work so hard while other people coasted through life was so extreme that he went crazy and killed himself. The idea that at some point after he's got the highest grades in the class, finished his 8-hour shift, and then been made fun of by the rich frat bros, he's suddenly going to achieve enlightenment and say, that I'm smarter than everyone else isn't a reason for me to feel superior to them, just doesn't make sense. On the contrary, being objectively better than everyone else and working harder than them would only increase his sense of entitlement when he's actually in a position of power and wealth. If Malcolm did become president after this path, I can only ever see him being basically evil. He's been pushed down and taken advantage of his whole life, all the while believing he's better than everyone around him. Once he has that power, he's going to immediately use it to enrich himself and strike out against the world that's caused him nothing but misery every step of his way to success. So I'm sorry, but President Malcolm is just a terrible idea. Canonically, it wouldn't actually happen, but if it did happen, it would be a disaster. And in terms of his characterization, it's not a great conclusion. Also, becoming the president is such an uninspired choice for a gifted character. Obviously, it's also Lisa's canonical ending in The Simpsons. At least in that case, though, Lisa has shown plenty of interest in politics before. I do think the finale was right to focus on Malcolm's big character flaw in his arrogance, but the the execution didn't work at all. The ending for Malcolm needs to be a lot more reminiscent of the ending for Francis and Reese. In other words, him ending up in a job that some people might consider quite miserable, but being happy with it anyway. Malcolm clearly thinks he's above the circumstances of his life, and he won't ever confront those feelings if he continues to live a crappy life while actively aspiring to be the most powerful person in the country. So yeah, he should have a crappy job, but not with the expectation that he'll resent it the whole time and is only doing it because eventually he can become president like he truly deserves. I don't think his conclusion should be entirely sad. Ideally, there should be a reason why he decides to go into a job that's less glamorous but is fulfilling. Maybe he meets a girl and ends up committing to her in a way that limits his options in terms of what job he can have. Or maybe he decides to work right away so he can help his own family out financially. Since I've already said I'd prefer if Francis stuck around at the grotto, Malcolm could steal his ending by getting a pretty boring corporate job but actually being happy to do it. But you know, I'm not suggesting this would be a great ending. Like I already said, it's really hard to end shows. I don't want Malcolm in the Middle to have ended, but since it had to end, I think the ending would have been better if it was a bit more consistent with the overall tone and themes of the show, and of course with Malcolm's character. Anyway everyone, thanks for watching. I genuinely didn't plan to release a video about someone becoming president so soon after the US election. I was just thinking of quick, easy ideas for a video, and this was one I had written down. Also, I believe this is the first election year where Malcolm would have been eligible to run for president based on his canonical age, or possibly the very last year where he wouldn't be. I'm not totally sure how old he is. Either way, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and so on. Click this video on screen now to watch more of my videos, and have a happy Thanksgiving. Goodbye.